rancher gave his last meal to a wounded Apache. By sunrise, 500 warriors were kneeling in his yard. But Jeremiah Whitmore had no idea that the dying man bleeding out on his porch would change everything he believed about enemies and honor. The sun was merciless that morning, beating down on the cracked earth of Jed's ranch like a hammer on an anvil. He stepped outside to check his water barrels, the same routine he'd followed for 15 years since Martha passed. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the distant mountains that looked like jagged teeth against the sky. That's when he saw him. A man lay face down near his fence line, dark hair matted with blood, wearing buckskin and beadwork that told Jed everything he needed to know. Apache. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. A trail of crimson led from the fence to where he'd collapsed. Like he'd crawled the last 50 yards on sheer will alone. Jed's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against his doorframe. Every settler in the territory knew the stories. Apache raids, burned homesteads, families that disappeared in the night and were never seen again. The smart thing would be to let nature take its course. The safe thing would be to ride to town and let Sheriff Mackenzie deal with the body later. But something about the way the man's fingers clawed at the dirt, fighting for every breath, made Jed's feet move toward him instead of away. The Apache couldn't be more than 25, Jed realized as he got closer. Young enough to be someone's son. The wound in his side was deep, probably from a cavalry saber, and he'd lost enough blood to paint the ground beneath him. His eyes fluttered open as Jed's shadow fell across his face. Dark eyes filled with pain, but no fear. Even dying, he stared up at Jed with the kind of dignity that made grown men step aside. Jed crouched down, close enough to see the intricate beadwork on the man's vest, close enough to smell the sage and smoke in his hair. This wasn't just any Apache warrior. The craftsmanship of his clothes, the silver band on his arm, the way he carried himself even while bleeding to death. This was someone important. The young man's lips moved, forming words in a language Jed didn't understand, but the meaning was clear in his eyes. Help me, or let me die with honor. Your choice. Jed looked back at his cabin, then down at the warrior who should have been his enemy. Martha's voice echoed in his memory from all those Sunday sermons she'd dragged him to. When you help the least of these, you help me. She'd always been better at seeing the person instead of the problem. He made his decision. Jed slipped his arms under the Apache's shoulders and knees, surprised by how light he felt, like the life was already halfway gone. The man's head fell back, revealing a face that would have been handsome if it weren't gray with approaching death. As Jed carried him toward the cabin, he felt the warrior's blood soaking through his shirt, warm and sticky. But as he reached his porch, something made him pause. In the distance, barely visible against the heat shimmer, he could see dust clouds on the horizon, multiple riders moving fast. Whether they were cavalry or Apache, Jed couldn't tell, but they were coming this way, and he'd just made a choice that might cost him everything. Jed kicked the cabin door open and laid the Apache on Martha's old quilting table, the same one where she'd mended his shirts and bandaged his cuts from ornery cattle. Now it would serve a purpose she never could have imagined. The warrior's breathing was getting shallower, each breath a struggle that might be his last. The dust clouds were getting closer. Jed could see them through his window now, maybe 10 minutes out. His hands moved without thinking, tearing strips from one of Martha's old sheets. The irony wasn't lost on him, using his dead wife's linens to save the life of a man whose people were supposed to be his enemies. As he pressed the cloth against the Apache's wound, trying to stop the bleeding, the warrior's eyes opened again. This time there was something different in them. Recognition, intelligence, and something that looked almost like amusement. The young man spoke again, this time in broken English. You know what you do? Jed kept pressure on the wound. I know I'm probably the biggest fool in the territory. My people, they come for me. I figured as much. Jed glanced toward the window. The riders were close enough now that he could make out individual horses. 5 of them, riding hard. Question is, are they going to thank me or scalp me? The Apache's lips curved into what might have been a smile if he weren't dying. That depends. On what? On who? I am. Before Jed could ask what that meant, the warrior's hand moved to a leather pouch at his waist. With trembling fingers, he pulled out something that made Jed's blood run cold. It was a medallion, carved from what looked like turquoise and silver, bearing symbols that seemed to dance in the lamplight. But it wasn't just any trinket. Jed had seen drawings of it in wanted posters. This was the mark of an Apache war chief's son. The riders were at his fence line now. Jed could hear their horses snorting, could see the glint of weapons in the afternoon sun. 5 Apache warriors, painted for war, and they'd tracked their missing brother right to his front door. "Your name," Jed said quickly. "What's your name?" "Ayana," the warrior whispered. "Son of Chief Nalnish." Jed's heart sank. Nailnish. Even he'd heard that name whispered in saloons and around campfires. The chief who'd unified 3 Apache bands. The man who'd been fighting the cavalry to a standstill for 2 years. And Jed had just invited his wounded son into his home. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Jed moved to his rifle, then stopped. 5 armed warriors against 1 rancher with an old Springfield? That wasn't a fight. That was suicide. Instead, he did something that went against every survival instinct he'd developed in 15 years of frontier life. He opened his door and stepped onto the porch, hands visible and empty. The Apache warriors pulled up 20 yards from his cabin, close enough that Jed could see the war paint on their faces, close enough to count the weapons each man carried. The leader was older, maybe 40, with scars that told stories of battles Jed didn't want to imagine. His eyes swept over Jed, then fixed on the cabin behind him. "Where is he?" the leader asked in English that was better than most cowboys Jed knew. Jed felt sweat running down his back despite the cool afternoon air. "He's inside. He's hurt bad." "You took him inside?" "Yes." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The other Apache exchanged glances, hands moving closer to their weapons. Jed realized he'd just confessed to something that could be seen as either mercy or capture. "Why?" the leader asked. It was a simple question, but Jed knew his life hung on the answer. He thought of Martha, of the Sunday sermons, of the man inside who was fighting for every breath. He thought of the choice between being safe and being right. "Because he was dying," Jed said, "and I couldn't watch a man die when I could help." The leader studied him for a long moment, then dismounted. The other warriors followed suit, and Jed noticed they moved like men who'd never known fear. As they approached the porch, the leader's eyes never left Jed's face. "My name is Dakota," he said. "Ayana is my nephew. If he dies because of your help, or if he dies because you delayed our medicine, either way you die with him." But as Dakota reached the porch steps, a voice called out from inside the cabin. Weak, but unmistakably alive. Ayana was saying something in Apache, his voice carrying a tone that made all 5 warriors stop in their tracks. Dakota's expression changed. Not softer exactly, but different, more complicated. "What did he say?" Jed asked. Dakota looked at him with something that might have been respect. "He said you gave him water from your own cup, and that you used your woman's sacred cloth to bind his wounds." The warrior paused. "He says you treated him like family." Jed felt something shift in the air between them, like the moment before a storm breaks, but he couldn't tell if it would bring rain or lightning. Dakota stepped into the cabin, and Jed followed, unsure if he was walking into his salvation or his grave. The other warriors remained outside, but their presence felt like a loaded gun pointed at his back. Inside, Ayana looked even worse than before. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that Jed recognized from his days in the war. The young man was slipping away, and they all knew it, but his eyes were alert, and when he saw his uncle, he spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice gaining strength with urgency. Dakota listened, then knelt beside the table. He examined Jed's rough bandaging work, touched his nephew's forehead, and spoke back in their language. The conversation went on for several minutes, and Jed caught the intensity in their voices, the weight of whatever they were discussing. Finally, Dakota stood and faced Jed. "Ayana says you also gave him food. Your last food." Jed glanced at the empty pot on his stove, the one that had held the last of his beans and salt pork. He'd planned to ride to town tomorrow for supplies, but when he saw the Apache's condition, he'd heated the stew and spooned it between the warrior's lips without thinking. "Man was starving," Jed said simply. "I had food. Seemed obvious." "Nothing is obvious between our peoples," Dakota replied. "For 50 seasons, your people have taken our land, killed our buffalo, broken every promise. For 50 seasons my people have fought back, taken your scalps, burned your homes. You should have left him to die. We should kill you for touching him." Jed felt his mouth go dry. But Ayana tells me something else. He says when you thought he was unconscious, you spoke to him. You told him about your woman who died. You said she would have wanted you to help any man in need, no matter his blood. The memory came back sharp and clear. Jed had been delirious with exhaustion and worry, talking to the unconscious Apache like he sometimes talked to Martha's grave. He'd forgotten anyone might have been listening. She was better than me, Jed said. Better than most folks. Dakota studied him with those dark, unreadable eyes. Ayanna says your woman's spirit still lives in this place. He can feel her approval of what you've done. The warrior paused. This presents complications. Before Jed could ask what kind of complications, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts in Apache, the sound of horses moving fast. Dakota was at the window in an instant, and what he saw made him curse in 2 languages. More riders coming, he said grimly, but not ours. Jed looked out and felt his heart sink. 6 men on horseback, approaching at a gallop, and he recognized the lead rider even from a distance. Buck Henley, the territory's most notorious Apache hunter, a man who collected bounties on Apache scalps and asked questions. Never. Dakota, Jed said urgently, you and your men need to get out of here. Now. But Dakota shook his head. We don't abandon family, and Ayanna cannot be moved. Then you're all dead men. Henley doesn't take prisoners. The 2 men looked at each other, enemy and ally in the same breath, united by the impossible situation bearing down on them. Outside, Henley's voice rang out across the yard. Whitmore, we tracked Apache sign to your property. Send them out, or we're coming in. Dakota's hand moved to his knife. How long have you known this Henley? Too long, Jed said. And he's not the talking type. Neither am I, Dakota replied, and something in his voice made Jed realize that the real fight hadn't even started yet. Henley's voice cut through the air again, closer now. Whitmore, you've got 30 seconds before we come in shooting. Jed looked at Dakota, then at Ayanna, who was trying to sit up despite his wounds. The young Apache's face was determined, but Jed could see he wouldn't last 5 minutes in a fight. There's a root cellar, Jed said quickly to Dakota, under the kitchen floorboards. It's where Martha and I used to hide during tornado season. Your nephew could— No. Ayanna's voice was weak but firm. I will not hide while my uncle fights. You'll die if you don't, Jed shot back. Then I die with honor. Dakota moved to the window, assessing their options. 4 Apache warriors outside, outnumbered and caught in the open. Inside, a dying war chief's son who refused to hide, 1 rancher with limited ammunition, and himself, against 6 men who killed Apache for sport. Whitmore, Henley called out. Last chance, we know they're in there. Jed made a decision that surprised even himself. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. What are you doing? Dakota asked. What Martha would have wanted me to do. Jed stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand but pointed down. Henley and his men had formed a semicircle around the cabin, all armed, all eager for violence. Henley himself was exactly what nightmares were made of. Scarred face, dead eyes, and a necklace of Apache scalps around his throat. Buck, Jed called out, keeping his voice steady. No Apache here, just me and my empty cabin. Henley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We followed their tracks right to your door, Whitmore. Don't insult my intelligence. Tracks could be old, could be from anybody, could be, but they're not. Henley spurred his horse closer. See, one of my boys has a particular talent for reading sign. Says 5 Apache warriors rode hard to this exact spot not 20 minutes ago. Says they're still here. Jed felt sweat beading on his forehead. Your boy's mistaken. Am I? Henley gestured to one of his men, who dismounted and walked to where the Apache horses had churned up the dirt. Fresh prints, still warm horse droppings. And look here. He held up something that made Jed's stomach drop. An Apache arrow that must have fallen from one of the warriors' quivers. If you were Jed, what would you do? Stand your ground and probably die defending people who were supposed to be your enemies? Or step aside and let Henley do what he came to do? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. Because what Jed decided next would either save them all, or doom everyone in that cabin. Jed looked Henley in the eye and made his choice. Buck, I'm telling you one more time. There's nobody here but me. Henley's expression turned ugly. Then you won't mind if we search the place. Actually, I do mind. This is my property, and you're not welcome on it. The bounty hunter's hand moved to his gun. You picking sides, Whitmore? Because if you are, you're picking the wrong one. Behind Jed, he heard the soft sound of the cabin door opening. Dakota stepped out. moving with the fluid grace of a man born to war. He held no weapon, but something about his presence made Henley's men shift uneasily in their saddles. "I am Dakota of the Chiricahua," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I have come for my nephew, who lies wounded inside. We seek no fight with you." Henley's laugh was harsh. "No fight? You're Apache. Fighting's all you people know. Today we came only for family. Today, you die." Henley drew his gun. But as he did, the other Apache warriors emerged from their concealment around the cabin. They'd positioned themselves perfectly while Jed and Henley talked, turning the bounty hunter's ambush into a trap of their own. The yard fell silent except for the sound of weapons being cocked and the nervous snorting of horses. 6 against 5. But Jed realized he was standing right in the middle of a powder keg that was about to explode. And inside the cabin, Ayanna was trying to get to his feet, despite wounds that should have kept him down. Through the window, Jed could see the young warrior reaching for a rifle that one of his uncle's men had left behind. Whatever happened next, Jed knew there would be no going back to his quiet life of tending cattle and talking to Martha's memory. The standoff stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Henley's eyes darted between the Apache warriors who had him surrounded, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. But Jed knew the bounty hunter well enough to recognize the look on his face. Buck Henley had never backed down from a fight in his life, even when he should have. "You made a mistake, Whitmore," Henley said, his gun still drawn but no longer pointed with confidence. "Helping Apache makes you Apache, and we both know what I do to Apache." Before Jed could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Ayanna appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame but standing upright. Despite his wounds, despite the blood loss, the young warrior carried himself with an authority that made even Henley pause. "I am Ayanna, son of Chief Nalnish," he said, his English clear despite his weakness. "And this man," he gestured to Jed, "has shown honor that your people have forgotten." Henley's expression changed. Not fear, exactly, but a new kind of calculation. Chief Nalnish's son would bring a bounty larger than anything he'd ever collected, but he'd also bring the wrath of the most powerful Apache leader in the territory. "Well, well," Henley said slowly, "the chief's boy himself. Do you know what you're worth to me, son? Do you know what killing me will cost you?" Ayanna replied, "My father has 300 warriors. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth, if they can find me." From inside the cabin came the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Ayanna swayed, and Jed realized the young man was operating on pure willpower and pride. He was dying on his feet, but he wouldn't show weakness in front of enemies. Dakota spoke rapidly in Apache to his nephew, clearly telling him to get back inside, but Ayanna shook his head. Whatever he said back made the older warrior's face tighten, with what looked like both pride and frustration. "What's he saying?" Henley demanded. Dakota's voice was grim when he translated. "He says that this rancher gave him food when he was starving, water when he was dying, and shelter when he had none. He says such honor creates debts that must be repaid." "Apache honor," Henley spat, "worth about as much as Apache promises. My nephew has just declared a blood bond with this man," Dakota continued, ignoring the insult. "By Apache law, an attack on Jeremiah Whitmore is now an attack on Chief Nalnish himself." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jed felt the weight of what had just happened, even if he didn't fully understand it. Somehow, by simply doing what felt right, he'd just become family to the most feared Apache chief in the territory. Henley's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "You're bluffing." Ayanna reached into his shirt and pulled out a second medallion, this one different from the first. Made of gold and turquoise, it bore symbols that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. With obvious effort, he removed it from around his neck and held it out to Jed. "This belonged to my grandfather," Ayanna said, "and his grandfather before him. It marks you as family, as protected by our tribe." Jed stared at the medallion, understanding that his life had just changed forever. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. But as he reached for it, Henley made his move. "Like hell," the bounty hunter snarled, raising his gun toward Ayanna. The explosion of gunfire that followed would echo across the territory for years to come. But what happened in those few seconds of chaos would determine whether Jed lived to see another sunset, and whether the fragile peace he'd helped create would survive the violence that men like Henley brought wherever they went. The gunfire erupted like thunder, but it wasn't Henley's shot that rang out first. Dakota's rifle spoke, and the bounty hunter's gun went spinning from his hand as blood bloomed across his knuckles. In the same instant, the Apache warriors moved like shadows come to life, and 3 of Henley's men found themselves staring down arrow points pressed against their throats. But the remaining bounty hunters weren't done fighting. The man called Jackson rolled from his horse, rifle in hand, and put a bullet through the cabin wall inches from where Ayanna stood. The young Apache warrior tried to dodge but collapsed instead, his strength finally failing him. Jed didn't remember making the decision to move. One moment he was standing on his porch, the next he was throwing himself between Jackson and the fallen Ayanna, raising his own rifle. The crack of Jackson's second shot echoed across the yard, and Jed felt something hot tear across his shoulder, spinning him around. Through the pain and confusion, he heard Dakota shouting orders in Apache. The remaining bounty hunters found themselves facing a coordinated attack from warriors who fought like they'd been born for this moment. But Henley, clutching his bloodied hand, was backing toward his horse with murder in his eyes. "This ain't over, Whitmore," he screamed. "You think that trinket makes you safe? I'll be back with the cavalry. Every Apache lover in this territory is gonna burn." Dakota could have put an arrow through Henley's back as he mounted his horse, but he held his fire. Jed understood why. Killing the bounty hunter here would bring exactly the kind of attention they were trying to avoid. As Henley and his surviving men rode hard toward town, kicking up a dust cloud that looked like a brown scar against the sky, an eerie quiet settled over the ranch. Jed looked down at his shoulder, where blood was seeping through his shirt, then at Ayanna, who was unconscious again but still breathing. "You're wounded," Dakota said, approaching with something that might have been respect in his voice. "So's your nephew. We should see to him first." "No." The older warrior examined Jed's shoulder with surprisingly gentle hands. Ayanna spoke truly. "You have shown honor that creates debts. My people will remember what happened here today." As Dakota cleaned and bound Jed's wound with strips torn from the same sheets they'd used on Ayanna, the other Apache warriors stood guard around the cabin, but Jed could see the worry in their faces. Henley would keep his word about returning with the cavalry, and when he did, there would be no talking their way out of it. "How long do we have?" Jed asked. "Henley will ride hard to the fort. With a story about Apache raiders holding a white rancher hostage, he'll have 20 cavalry soldiers here by tomorrow night." Dakota finished bandaging Jed's shoulder. "But Ayanna cannot be moved. Not yet. Then we make our stand here." Dakota studied him. "You understand what you're saying? 20 cavalry soldiers against 5 Apache warriors and 1 wounded rancher? We will all die." Jed looked through his window at Ayanna, who was still unconscious on Martha's quilting table. The young man's breathing was steadier now, but he was far from healed. Maybe, but running would be worse. Why? It was a simple question, but Jed found himself thinking of Martha again, of the promises he'd made at her graveside, of the man he'd tried to become since she'd been gone. Because some things matter more than staying alive. Dakota was quiet for a long moment. Then he whistled, a low sound that carried across the yard like a bird call. The other Apache warriors gathered around, and he spoke to them in their language. Whatever he said made them look at Jed with new eyes. "I have told them what you said," Dakota explained, "about some things mattering more than life. It is an Apache way of thinking. What happens now? Now we prepare for war." Dakota looked toward the horizon where the dust from Henley's retreat was still visible. "But first, I must send word to my brother. Chief Nalnish must know that his son has found a friend worth dying for." One of the younger warriors mounted his horse and rode out into the gathering dusk, carrying a message that would travel faster than any cavalry patrol. As Jed watched him disappear into the shadows between the hills, he realized that tomorrow would bring either his death or something even more unlikely. The sight of the most feared Apache war chief in the territory riding to the aid of a simple rancher who'd chosen compassion over fear. But tonight, he had wounded men to tend to and a defense to prepare. And somewhere in the darkness, Buck Henley was spinning a story that would bring down the wrath of the entire territorial army. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky the color of old blood. Jed had barely slept, spending the night checking on Ayanna and helping Dakota's men prepare defensive positions around the cabin. The young Apache's fever had broken just before sunrise, and his breathing had grown stronger, but he was still too weak to travel. They all heard the horses before they saw them. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the plains, but it grew steadily louder. Jed stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, expecting to see Henley riding back with a cavalry patrol. Instead, what he saw made his knees nearly buckle. The horizon was alive with riders. Not 20 cavalry soldiers, but hundreds of Apache warriors, their horses moving like a dark wave across the grassland. At their head rode a figure that could only be Chief Nalnish himself. Tall, proud, wearing the war paint and eagle feathers that marked him as one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Jesus," Jed whispered. Dakota emerged from the cabin, took one look at the approaching army, and smiled grimly. "My brother received my message. How many are there?" "I count nearly 500 warriors from 3 allied bands." Dakota's voice carried a note of awe. "I have never seen so many of our people gathered in one place." The Apache army flowed around Jed's ranch like water around a stone, taking positions that stretched as far as the eye could see. But they didn't approach the cabin itself. Instead, they began a ritual that Jed had never witnessed before. Hundreds of warriors dismounting and kneeling in perfect silence, facing the small building where their chief's son lay recovering. Chief Nalnish himself rode forward alone, stopping just short of the porch. He was older than Jed had expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through his black hair and scars that spoke of countless battles. But his eyes held the same dignity Jed had seen in his son. "You are Jeremiah Whitmore," the chief said in English that was precise and formal. "I am. My son lives because of your kindness. Any man would have done the same." Nalnish shook his head slowly. "No. Any man would have left him to die or killed him for the bounty. You chose a different path." The chief dismounted and approached the porch. "Dakota tells me you were wounded defending my son. Show me." Jed pulled back his shirt to reveal the bandaged bullet graze on his shoulder. Nalnish examined it with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen many battle wounds. "You bled for Apache blood," the chief said. "This creates bonds that cannot be broken." From inside the cabin came the sound of movement. Ayana appeared in the doorway, still pale but standing under his own power. When he saw his father, his face lit up with joy and relief. "Father," he said in English, clearly wanting Jed to understand. "This man saved my life. He gave me his last food, his last water, and put himself in danger to protect me." Chief Nalnish turned back to Jed. "My son tells me you spoke of your woman, the one who walks in the spirit world. He says her wisdom guided your actions. Martha always said we should help folks when we can. Didn't matter who they were." The chief nodded slowly. "She was wise, and her wisdom has changed the path of our peoples." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a medallion unlike any Jed had ever seen, carved from silver and turquoise, bearing symbols that seemed ancient beyond measure. "This marks you as brother to the Apache nation," Nalnish said, placing the medallion around Jed's neck. "Any who harm you harm us. Any who threaten you, threaten our children. You are family now. Jeremiah Whitmore. Forever." As if on signal, the 500 warriors rose from their kneeling positions and let out a war cry that echoed across the territory. Not a sound of threat, but of celebration and acceptance. Jed looked out at the sea of faces, all watching him with respect, and felt Martha's presence stronger than he had since the day she died. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of Henley's cavalry patrol. But they stopped when they saw the Apache army, recognizing that any attack would mean the start of a war they couldn't win. After a long hesitation, they turned and rode back the way they'd come. Chief Nalnish smiled. "Your enemies have decided that discretion serves them better than valor today." As the Apache army began to disperse, melting back into the landscape like morning mist, Jed realized that his quiet life was over forever. But in its place, he'd gained something he'd never expected. A family that stretched across tribal boundaries and a legacy that would outlive them all. Ayana clasped his hand before mounting his horse. "When you need us, we will come. All of us." And as the last of the warriors disappeared into the distance, Jed stood on his porch, wearing the medallion of Apache Brotherhood, knowing that Martha would have been proud of the choice he'd made, the choice to see a man in need instead of an enemy to fear. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.